Hi there. Welcome back to the Montessori project. It's nice to see you again, and thank you so much for tuning in. Today, I'd like to talk about the phenomenon of peer pressure and what we can learn from the Montessori method that might help us deal with peer pressure with our kids, which especially starts to become problematic when they're sort of junior high and high school age. Of course, Montessori method is well known for dealing for its theory of education with younger children. But the concept that was behind Montessori's method is imitation. And it really becomes quite helpful to think about peer pressure as sort of a form of imitation. So Montessori observed that young children learn and develop and grow through a process of imitating the people and the culture around them. And this process is quite natural, and it doesn't end just because we've left childhood behind, right? So, one of the things that it's good to think about is the way in which imitation is kind of a form of influence, of how we influence one another for good or ill, which is really what peer pressure is about. And the school of thought that Montessori was very involved in, it was very sort of cutting edge at the time, was a school of anthropology that was really studying this phenomenon of influence and how we as individuals really don't exist as separate entities apart from the way we have relationships, apart from our relationships with the people around us. One example of this is to look at how the ideas, the understanding of hypnotism sort of evolved and changed. So hypnotism was sort of a recent discovery in the 1800s. And at first, when it first emerged as a phenomenon, people thought you could be hypnotized because of the power of the hypnotist, right? The hypnotist exerted this incredible power over others. And so that's how it happened. And then they began to shift, the thinking around it began to shift to the person, the subject who's being hypnotized. And people began to think, well, the reason people get hypnotized is because they're susceptible. They have a weakness of character, or they're easily influenced and can be made to imitate any suggestion that the hypnotist offers. So it was less the power of the hypnotist than the susceptibility of the one being hypnotized. And then it really began to shift, and people began to see this less as some sort of an unusual phenomenon, as something that was sort of normal. That even though the hypnotist and hypnotic subject seems like a rare event, that's sort of part of the normal way humans operate. We're always in a relationship of influence. And often it's unconscious, not unlike the way a post hypnotic suggestion might work. You know, when a hypnotist could leave a suggestion inside the head of one of their subjects, and the next day the subject might, when they hear a bell ring, go make a phone call or something, So they would be under the influence of the hypnotist, even when the hypnotist wasn't anywhere around. And so they began to realize, the anthropologists and social psychologists that Maria Montessori was working with, her colleagues, began to see that the phenomenon of influence is the normal pattern of human behavior. So one of the stories, a popular story that emerged at the time in the 1890s, was a political satire, what we know as a Disney movie, Pinocchio, right? The book Pinocchio was written by Carlo Collodi, and it was serialized and then turned into a book in the 1890s when Dr. Montessori was beginning her career. And Pinocchio, as we all know, is a puppet without strings, okay, which is really an impossibility, right? Puppets are manipulated by others. But this character of Pinocchio represents this concept that even though we are always being influenced by one another like a puppet with strings, we deny that those strings are there, right? We cling to a feeling and sense of our own autonomy rather than acknowledge the reality that we're always in a mutual dance with other people, being influenced by them, imitating them, learning who we are and how to behave by observing and imitating the world around us. So this is, of course, what peer pressure is all about, isn't it? It is the way in which we see our children being influenced, for good or ill, by their peers. It's why we're always so concerned about who our children are hanging out with, who are their friends, who are the adults that they're interacting with. Because we want to be sure that they're being influenced in a way that's for their good, right? And that's representing the values that our families hold dear. So we want to make sure our kids are being surrounded by a community of care and people that have their own best interests at heart. So when we see that our children are being influenced by people who perhaps are leading them astray, which is what this marvelous book of Pinocchio is all about. Pinocchio goes on this one series of adventures after another in which he is being taken advantage of and lied to and manipulated, and people steal from him and teach him all the wrong values, get him to skip school. I mean, it's just one series of disasters after another until Pinocchio learns that he can't trust these people who are really manipulating him for their own benefit. So one of the things I think that becomes problematic in our conversation with our kids about peer pressure is we are often sitting in a critical mode with them. We observe things that we don't like about what their community is like, who they're hanging out with, and so forth, and we try and persuade them to stop being friends with so and so, to don't date this person, and that sort of thing. And that's just never going to get you anywhere, because the kids are not doing these, hanging out with people because they're trying to be disobedient to you or whatever. It's just because they want to belong and be accepted. And so coming at them in that judgmental way isn't very helpful. Plus, it is extraordinarily hypocritical. And I think that's part of the problem, that the kids sense our hypocrisy, and that's what they're responding to. Because it's not that only our kids are influenced by peers, we are too, right? We continue to be under the influence of the people around us, and we can express that. It shows up in common language where we'll say something like, "Oh, he brings out the best in me," or "She brings out the worst in me." I mean, that's just an expression that who we are with and who we associate with tends to either make us a better person or makes us less than we know we can be as a person. So I think when we're talking with our children about peer pressure, it needs to be a conversation that puts us all on the same side, right? So that we can just talk with our kids about the phenomenon of our interrelatedness, about how people influence us for good or ill, and it happens to us too. And I think we need to be very honest with our kids about that, and maybe even ask them if they observe that our strings are being pulled by people that or ideas that aren't in our best interests. Our kids observe us, and they are very keen to um, have us have them as the center of our lives, you know. And sometimes we get led astray, and our focus goes off in the wrong direction because we are being influenced by other people's ideas of what does it mean to be successful or popular or well liked, and we forget that the people who are most important to us may not be getting all of our attention. So I think what I'd like to just remind you of is that um, peer pressure is a natural phenomenon. It's not necessarily bad. Peers influence us for good. Um, but our kids are not any more susceptible to it than we are. It's just that we can see how their strings are being pulled, and like Pinocchio, we pretend we don't have any strings. So I think the best way to have a conversation with your children about this is to acknowledge that we're all a little bit under the influence of others, and that the best way to to be sure that the influence is one that we are happy with is to make it conscious, to not go around as if we're under a post-hypnotic suggestion and pretending that these influences aren't there. The best thing you can do for yourself, for your kids, for your whole family is to look at what what is pulling your strings, who or what is influencing you, and are you happy with that? If not, you can choose to change, right? Just like you want your friends to change their friends. If things aren't going well, you can change too, about the values and the influences that you are under. So I hope that helps. Montessori's ideas about imitation and the ways in which we influence each other are really helpful in this regard. So I hope that helped. I'd love to hear from you, any questions or comments or examples of this from your life. And I'll talk to you soon.